Questions, Montek. Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia, distinguished speakers who I see in the audience who've taken the trouble to come from long distance, academics, policymakers, friends of ICRIER, representatives from the print and electronic media, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me immense pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to ICRIER's 6th annual G20 conference. I'm really happy to say that this conference has become a permanent and significant part of ICRIER's annual calendar. Many of you in the audience have already participated in the previous conferences, and I welcome you back. And those participating for the first time, a very warm welcome, and I do hope you have a productive meeting. This meeting has been made possible by generous financial and intellectual support from our long-standing partners in this initiative, who you see in the backdrop, the Australian High Commission, the Australian government, the World Bank, and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, who we kind of call as CAS. Representing these organizations, Ambassador Patrick Suckling, Matt Crook, Ono Rule, Lars Schmidt, and Pankaj Madan, we're immensely grateful to all of you for your invaluable support and constant encouragement throughout the planning stages of this conference. Most of you know this, we've been doing this since 2009, and along with the partners, and there were kind of many partners even before this. I remember some partners who we had in the previous years. And so we've collaborated with many institutions, many partners, G20 member countries, international financial institutions, to deliberate on a range of issues. And you'll see that in the conference packet before you, the conference program that we've chalked out this year. The 2012 conference, 2 years ago, resulted in an edited volume that was published by Springer Verlag. The editors were Mike Callahan, who was here in the previous year, Chetan sitting in the audience, Stephen Pickford, who was here, and Francis were the editors of this volume, which came out last year. And last year's conference is going to be also produced in an edited volume, which will come out later this year. All the papers have been received, they are being refereed, and once they are refereed, then they'll be formatted, and we'll have the second volume out before the end of this year, perhaps in December. This year's G20 conference, the theme of which you will see, but what we've tried to do in the backdrop of what's happening in the world, what we've tried to do in terms of, and you probably know this, and I won't say this, is that there's two-paced recovery. There were expectations that there will be recovery, but the stronger growth expected has been muted, and there have been downgrades of the forecast by the IMF, downgrades by about 0.5%. And within this backdrop, what we decided to do in this conference was we've chosen 6 themes. We start from macro and go down to sectoral, which is essentially what we had also done last year. And the macro themes are quantitative easing, shadow banking systems, how it will be regulated. We've got international tax reform. And then we've got sectoral themes, manufacturing and growth, the impact of innovation and energy policy. As you know, energy policy has become extremely important, including in G20, including in Australia. And how are these energy policies going to evolve in both developed and developing countries? And of course, the long-standing issue of reform, especially in the context of emerging markets, is how are international organizations going to reform and what's the way forward. So these are the 6 themes that you will see that we will deliberate over the next day and a half, beginning tomorrow morning. And those of you who've seen the communique that came out from Sydney in February, actually a 2-page communique, emphasized, and I quote, I'll just quote one sentence, and there's been a shorter communique in April, I understand, and I quote, "We deeply regret that the IMF quota and governance reforms agreed to in 2010 have not yet become effective." So one of the sessions, I think the last session that we have on Friday, will be devoted to international institutional reform. So we've balanced macro focus along with sectoral issues. And while examining the issues for growth, global imbalances, legitimacy of international financial institutions, the conference also focuses on the road to energy sustainability, as I said, implications for long-term institutional and investment finance, jobs, international tax reform, all of which have found an emphatic mention in the communique that has come out from Sydney. And we hope what we do over the next day and a half is going to be also reverberated in the Brisbane Action Plan, which will come out later this year. So that's about our conference and what we hope to achieve. But before I step aside and request Montek to deliver the dinner talk, let me say a few words about Montek. All the CVs, all the speakers are in the packets that you must have already received. But before that, I must say something about Montek, who's been really spearheading the G20 effort from India. He's been the Sherpa for G20 for India for many years, and it's really nice that he's going to once again give us this dinner talk. Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia was Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission until a little while ago, and he has been a key figure in India's economic reforms. For his outstanding contribution to economic policy and public service, he was conferred the Padma Vibhushan. You probably know this. Montek received his bachelor's from Stephens and went to Oxford. I want to say especially that apart from being a policy maker, he's also been an academic. And those of you who are academic economists know that publications in the top-notch journals really count for a lot. And he's published in journals that people will give an arm and a leg for. He's published in the AER, American Economic Review, I beg your pardon. He's published in the Journal of Political Economy, and he's published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. So clearly, extremely insightful, analytical, and just the right person, I think, to begin this dinner talk. So welcome, Montek, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Rajat, and thank you for the very kind words. Let me just begin by, first of all, congratulating ICRIER for so steadfastly sticking its flag on the G20 process and maintaining a momentum and getting these things thought about in the academic community. You do need much more support from the academic and professional community on the kind of thinking that's going on in the G20, and I'm really glad that you saw fit to invite me once again. I'm not, of course, the Sherpa anymore, so for the first time, you're really going to get the undiluted view of me in this whole area. Let me also welcome our participants from abroad, Mr. Barry Sterland in particular, who is the Australian finance deputy. That means that he's the guy who really runs the serious part of the G20, which is the finance track. And of course, it is the Australian presidency. So his presence, your presence, Barry, makes the meeting especially important. But welcome also to everybody else. And let me just say that I have been warned that I shouldn't speak for more than 20 minutes, because after all, people are waiting for lunch and their dinner. And it would be too much to deny them nourishment for too long a time. So I will try to limit myself to 20 minutes and basically make a series of disconnected sort of remarks. I mean, I thought about it and I said, no, what is it that one wants to comment on as far as the G20 is concerned? And obviously there are these areas which to some extent Rajat has already mentioned. I listed about 6 of them actually. One is the whole crisis management area. The other is the reform of global financial systems. The third is the progress on the development agenda, then trade and climate change, and then other items. Now, I can't sort of seriously discuss each of these, so my treatment of them may be a little disconnected. Let's just start with crisis management. You know, almost everybody who writes about the G20, and almost everybody has now written about the G20, they start off by saying they made a great start, but then ran out of steam. And I think what they mean by the great start is really that the bringing the economy out of what looked like a Great Depression type downslide was a very good idea, very good achievement. But later on, the return to normalcy was much below the repeated pronouncements of the IMF and also below expectations. Now, the only thing to question here, by the way, is that the benchmark that the global economy did better than it did in 1929, that's a very low bar. Because in the, 80 years or so since then, you would assume that even if there was no coordination, there had been enough learnt that we wouldn't be repeating the mistakes of 1929. It is true, it's absolutely true, that, and I tracked it myself, that if you look at the decline in production and the decline in the stock market in industrialized countries, for a few months it looked as if it was tracking 1929. The difference is that in 1929 it kept on going down, it didn't this time. So do we say that, well, you want to take away credit from the G20 for what they did in managing the crisis? I think that would be unfair. I don't think we would have had a 1929 depression, but it's quite possible that without the bringing together at the summit level of the key economies, that we would not have ended the downslide as quickly as we did. And I think there are two things here. One is the general coordination of we've got to have some expansionary policy, and persuading the countries that are traditionally not very happy with expansionary policies that maybe we'd do a little bit of that. But even more than that was the recognition in the rest of the world that, look, all these guys are sitting together and they're going to try and find a solution. So I think from a business expectations point of view, if the heads of the governments of 75% of the world GDP sort of get together and reassure everybody that, look, this is a crisis, we're really going to fix it, etc., I mean, it does have a somewhat positive effect. So I would give the, although the Great Depression avoidance is a very low benchmark, I think they did better than would have happened without this group. So that's definitely a plus. Now, on the other side, it is true that, growth never recovered as much as people thought. And what is worse, unemployment in the industrialized countries remained high and is still high in many of them, though slightly improving. And, you might say that this addresses the question, did the G20's mutual assessment process, mutual adjustment process, the MAP, which was meant to coordinate policies and bring about a more expansionary path, could it be that it has failed? Or at least it hasn't succeeded nearly as much as it should have. And I think that's quite clearly the case in terms of end results, because I think, I forget now, but there were several occasions when the IMF downgraded its own projections. So obviously, we didn't achieve what was meant to be achieved. Is that the result of lack of coordination, or is that the result of a more fundamental disagreement in the profession in industrialized countries as to what is it that should be done? I think it's the latter. Because the truth is that within the countries, it's possible that within Germany there was not much disagreement, but certainly within the United States, within the UK, and a lot of the European countries, there were very different views of what should be done. And the belief that primacy has to be given to the reduction in the fiscal deficit is not something on which the profession was united. In fact, in the United States, there is now a view that a lot of the reason why you've had problems is that the traditional macroeconomists who dominate the Treasury and the IMF and everything, for one reason or another, did not understand the linkage between the financial sector going wrong and what happens on the macro. And by and large, most macroeconomists typically understated. They took the financial sector for granted. They did not think hard enough that if the financial sector gets gummed up, then what's going to happen? And it's not easy, if it is gummed up, it's not actually easy to simply solve the problem through a fiscal stimulus either. So it's a much more complex question of setting things right. Now, why were they constantly optimistic? And I think here, again, what happened was that unrealistic assumptions were made about how demand would revive. I mean, the fundamental problem was that the global economy revived quite quickly after the subprime crisis, and then it kind of went into a collapse after the Eurozone crisis. And it was very difficult to get out of that. And I think that most people probably underestimated what was needed to shock the economy back into a better path. Because after all, what had happened was that the crisis reflected excess leverage. So everybody, the private sector had borrowed like mad. Many people had borrowed like mad. They're all trying to repair their balance sheets. So the usual argument is that if you've got a big fiscal deficit, you're, quote, crowding out the private sector. So you bring your fiscal deficit down and the private sector will go charging in, doing all kinds of good things. But if the private sector has got balance sheets that are ruined, then reducing the fiscal deficit is not going to lead to a compensating increase in private demand. And I don't think that I had the pleasure and the privilege of being a Sherpa, and sometimes I raised these issues. And it was always finessed in the discussions by saying, we have to have structural reform. So if only you have structural reform, then everything will be set right, investment will come, people will be reassured. Now, actually, Mr. Richardson will know that the IMF is constantly criticized by its own independent evaluation office of consistently overestimating the likely impact of whatever is called structural reform. So I think this is the other side of the coin, that in the MAP process, people would say we're going to do structural reform. It wasn't actually clear what that structural reform meant. Would it be enough? What would be the time lags, etc.? So I don't think there's an easy solution to that. And hopefully under the Australian presidency, we'll move to something a little better. But having said all that, I think we must recognize that these are difficult things. Sovereign governments do not like making policy changes by sitting around a table and listening to other sovereign governments tell them what to do. At the same time, the fact that they're meeting, more meeting of minds takes place through an exchange of these views, and over time, people move to a more common understanding. I would say that in the case of the G20, that has actually happened to a substantial extent. We can go into that, and I'm sure you will. I won't labor the point now. Briefly, on the reform of the global financial system, I think Rajat has already said that it hasn't proved easy to implement what was agreed with regard to the voting share change and the board composition change in the IMF. The proximate cause of the problem is simply that the US administration, which was very keen to implement it, is simply not being able to get Congress to agree. And that very often happens, that you may have a particular point taken by a government, but it can only be implemented if they can get legislative backing. So really, policy is mainly politics. It's not economics. So these are things you have to accept, and how they will move is not very clear. But I would like to say that there's to my mind, a big gap. I think there's too much discussion on voting shares, and I think they're all very important for ownership and representation. I'm not understating them. But the global financial architecture is not equal to the voting share in the IMF. And I think the biggest gap in this whole business is that the world has become much more interconnected because of financial flows. This is a sea change because the volume of financial flows is now so large that anything that disrupts them can lead to huge flows in and out, particularly of emerging market countries. And therefore, if one wants a well-functioning global architecture, one has to have an answer to, if there is much more likelihood of capital mobility, what should developing countries do? Now, at one time, in the mid-90s, I think, the professional top of the IMF used to take the view that, look, I mean, you either have full rigidity, and the usual example given was Argentina's currency board, which was assumed to be so absolutely rigid that, you know, everybody would expect that it will survive. We know what actually happened. Or you just be totally flexible, and there's not much in between. I think the fund has actually changed its view on that. So the present position is that the fund recognizes that, you know, some degree of capital controls are justified, but they haven't actually laid out an architecture of what should countries do. So I think there's a big gap over there, which I hope that, I mean, here it's something which should be resolved by professional discussion before it can just go to the G20. But I think that the global financial system is not just the voting shares of the IMF. I mean, that's an important part of it, but it's the functioning of the global system in the face of highly volatile capital flows, and how do you handle it, which I think is very crucial. Now, one area where there's been a lot of progress, and I think the G20 can claim credit for it, is this whole area of financial regulatory reform. That's been democratized. The FSB now has developing countries. Developing countries were much less affected by this regulatory stuff because they actually were more tightly regulated anyway. So they are quite happy to say, yes, let's go on with Basel III and so on. But, you know, as we move ahead in future, the advantage is we're in on the ground floor, but how financial regulation moves in future is something of interest. And the fact that the process is democratized means that there'll be greater ownership. And that's clearly a good thing, because otherwise you would have this situation of people thinking all these rules are being made by what used to be called the gnomes of Zurich. But now everybody's there and represented, which is good. Now, very briefly, I think I still have 5 minutes, 3 minutes? What? How many? 5. All right. There were 3 other areas I wanted to mention. One is, of course, the development agenda. You know, somewhere in Toronto in 2010, a working group was set up because the developing countries felt that this whole crisis thing is just how to save Europe from its own mistakes, and that the development agenda is being ignored. So a working group was set up. The Korean presidency at the summit in 2010 gave special emphasis to the development agenda, so they worked on it a little bit more. And what happened as a result was that, you know, a very broad-based sort of agenda on development was worked out, which actually, as I recall at one time, I mean, had 9 pillars. Now, this is an example of proliferation of ideas, and I'll just read the 9 pillars. Pillar 1, infrastructure. Pillar 2, private investment and job creation. Pillar 3, human resource development and skill creation. Pillar 4, trade. Pillar 5, financial inclusion. Pillar 6, growth with resilience. Pillar 7, food security. Pillar 8, domestic resource mobilization. And Pillar 9, knowledge sharing. Now, you know, these are mantras. I mean, they're good mantras, and you'll find them all in our own government documents. I'm sure the 12th plan has all of these things, and that's why whenever something is put forward, nobody can actually object to it. But I think one needs to ask the question, in which of these areas can international cooperation help? Because if nobody is cooperating, then it's just a matter of having an essay on development, and you get good practices and you should share them. I think that's a real issue. Now, this was recognized in the St. Petersburg summit in 2013. So they reduced it to 4 pillars: food security, infrastructure, financial inclusion, human resource development. Now, honestly, in all of these, in my view, it's only infrastructure where some international cooperation can take place. Because frankly, on food security, it boils down to lecturing each country how important food security is, and you must make sure that you produce enough food. And to some extent, lecturing countries not to impose restrictions on their own exports, which I think we have actually responded to quite well, in the sense we've said that for least developed countries, etc., we won't do it, and so on. In financial inclusion, what is the I mean, we agree we need financial inclusion, but there's not much international cooperation needed there. It's something that countries have to do themselves. Human resource development, of course, is motherhood, and again, it's not an area where much international negotiation is needed, but infrastructure is, and I think there, the entire use of the multilateral development banks in order to leverage private money into infrastructure does require a major agreement amongst the major shareholders. I think that there was a working group. I mean, my recollection is that the World Bank had promised that they would come back with an absolute sort of a clear set of proposals on how to maximize infrastructure financing by leveraging what the World Bank does. And I think if something happens in that area, it really would be, in my view, a very good thing. Trade, climate change, both extremely important. But you know, both of these are areas where the negotiations are legally and formally taking place in different fora. And I think this tension that, you know, can the G20 somehow give a lead on things that are being negotiated elsewhere? The hope, obviously, is that it can. Because, you know, honestly, 190 countries negotiating anything is not going to get anywhere. So the idea was that somehow the G20 would be able to get a reasonable consensus, and then that would drive the rest of the system. I think that as of now, the jury is out on that, because we've not had any success on the Doha round in trade. And on climate change, well, we'll see what will happen at the COP21 or whatever it is in Paris next year. But every attempt to bring these into the G20 has led to a reiteration of the formula in the case of climate change, that a suitable solution must be found within the framework of the UNFCCC, which basically says we all agree this is important and we'll try and solve it somewhere else. I think this is an important issue because my own feeling is that we won't get anywhere. I agree with the view that 192 countries cannot negotiate. But how we manage to orchestrate a consensus which reflects everybody's concerns in the G20 is a huge challenge. But if the G20 can do that, I think that would be a very good idea. There are many other items, you know, energy, anti-corruption, tax evasion, and most recently, gender gaps in women's labor force participation, which are all on the agenda of the G20. I think one of the most important things for the G20 is to recognize that, you know, the number of problems that the world has to face are huge. And I know that the Australian Sherpa Heather was very sympathetic to the idea that the Brisbane summit should have a much narrower focus, which basically says a lot of problems out there and many people are looking at it, but these are the 5 that we spent a lot of time discussing, and here's our contribution. And I think if we can get that, the G20 would in fact continue to make an impact in what is otherwise a world which desperately needs the reassurance that countries can cooperate, because that reassurance is actually fraying at the edges. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Montek. As you probably realize after listening to this, that it's a very Montek never disappoints. And you got evidence of that. So very, very thought-provoking in terms of both the agenda, of what the agenda for the G20 should be and what they're actually doing now, trying to create a balance where there should be 2 items, finance, infrastructure, extended to 5. You know, interesting thoughts. So we'll open it up to questions. It's informal. Please identify yourselves, be brief so that we can get as many